Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, a special 90-minute conversation co-hosted by MPQ and Shelterforce. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation.
Nothing to me, Steve? Yes, okay. So thank you. I'm Miriam Axelud. I'm the CEO and Editor-in-Chief at Shelterforce. I'm coming to you from Albany, New York on lands of the Haudenosaunee. Shelterforce is a national independent media voice focused on housing justice, affordable housing, and community development. And racial equity and the racial wealth gap are inseparable from the topics we cover because everything about housing has been racialized in this country. Like many longtime observers concerned with racial justice, I had been hearing from scholars and activists that the conventional wisdom around solutions to the racial wealth gap, often framed as merely increasing access to home ownership, business ownership, or higher education, wasn't sufficient either to explain what was happening or to chart a path forward to meaningful change. As a publication where that conventional wisdom has often showed up, it was important for us to explicitly and boldly lift up a broader view, which we did in our recent series, The Racial Wealth Gap, Moving to Systemic Solutions. NPQ's series on targeted universalism and today's conversation with this esteemed panel are also part of that courageous conversation, and I'm delighted to be taking part today.
Great, thanks, Miriam. And here are four authors from those two series who have joined us to continue the conversation from those article series. For this webinar, we are pleased to introduce Gary Cunningham, President and CEO of Prosperity Now, Jeremy Greer, co-founder and co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation, John A. Powell, director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, and Ann Price, president of the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. We'll start with some of our own and then get to yours. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen, and we will share them, as many of them as we can with the panelists. Second, we often get the question, will there be slides and recordings shared after the webinar? And the answer is yes. So no need to send chat messages asking that question. You will get them generally by Monday. And also, please feel encouraged to join the conversation via social media. We have the hashtag #RebuildTheEconomy. One last thing. I would like to gratefully acknowledge the support of Church Mutual, which ensures the place's property and people of purpose-driven organizations of all kinds. Visit churchmutual.com/NPQ to learn more about their insurance products. That's churchmutual.com/NPQ. So thanks for joining us. And please complete the brief survey after the webinar, which does inform future webinars and work at NPQ. And with that, I'll pass the baton back to my co-moderator, Miriam Axelud.
Great. So we're going to start this morning, or this afternoon for some of us, with Ann Price. Ann, can you talk to us about the article that you wrote for Shelterforce's series, help set the frame for our discussion here? What are some of the leading conventional approaches to addressing the racial wealth gap, and why do they fall short?
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. You know, I think that we have a blind spot when it comes to tackling the racial wealth gap. And that lapse in our vision really is driven by the incorrect belief that Black Americans can accumulate wealth in the same way with the same tools that has worked for white people, such as through education, homeownership, entrepreneurship alone. And that just simply is not the case. I think it's really important for us to understand how wealth in this country is accumulated. And the fact that for many white families throughout history, the government helped seed wealth for white families through free land, through government-backed mortgages, through farm loans, a social safety net. And that was done almost exclusively for white families while simultaneously blocking those wealth opportunities from Black families. And so it's important to understand that wealth is iterative, right? Wealth builds on each other and grows on wealth, right? So you need wealth in the first place. So we often don't look at the levers of extraction that have happened over generations for Black folks and why it's been so difficult for many families to build wealth. And I just want to give a couple of examples. One that really comes to mind is a new study that's been put out by Dania Francis, looking at what's happened to Black farmers and Black land over the course of history. You know, imagine that in the early 1900s, Black people had about 20 million acres of land. And that's the most land that Black people ever owned. 90% of that land has been taken, lost, right? And the economic cost of that has been estimated to be about $327 billion. So that's just one aspect of Black life. You can think about the New Deal and the fact that Black domestics and agricultural workers did not receive those benefits. It's been estimated that that's about $143 billion of lost wealth. And you go on and understand that policy after policy, even looking locally, there have been these levers of extraction. Look at Chicago, just through contract leasing, a predatory housing tool. Blacks during the 50s and 60s had about $3 to $4 billion taken from them because of this predatory approach. So I just want us to understand that government helped create wealth, and Black people have never had access to that kind of investment that white people have. So in turn, what we're seeing today is a struggle to kind of close the racial wealth gap. I just want to end by saying, in my article, I shared this personal story of one of my relatives. And I wanted to do that to make the point that when we think about wealth, class really comes into play much differently than when we look at income. And this incredible man's life, James Albert Parsons, someone who was able in the early 1900s to go and get a degree in engineering, to work for a company where he actually played a pivotal role in the development of stainless steel, created immense wealth for this company and really for the United States because he did a lot of work during World War II, could not build wealth for his own family. Why? Because he was in a red line neighborhood. Why? Because his income was capped. All of the things that really limit the ability to build wealth. So, you know, if we're going to really think about tackling this issue, we're going to have to think about this in a much different way. We need a new paradigm. We need a new North Star. We need one that's going to really understand these levers of extraction. We need to have a broader definition of wealth beyond the financial that's connected to the Black experience. Black people put collective well-being over individual circumstance as a way of surviving. And we need to understand ways to do that. We need a holistic approach that really encompasses the sphere of people, institutions, and neighborhoods. And we need to tackle some very pernicious tropes and narratives about Black people themselves, and address the issue of anti-Blackness. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anne. And I noticed you mentioned levers of extraction a couple of times, which is a great lead into what Jeremy has to say. So Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about your article for the Shelterforce series, some of the ways wealth is extracted from communities of color and why we need to focus on the extraction side of the equation?
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks, Steve. And I just want to start by saying it's really a privilege to be on this panel with people I respect so much, John, Gary, and Anne. So my article, which you can read on Shelterforce, you can also listen to our comms director, Kendra Botharth, Bozarth in her soothing voice read it to you if you go to the Shelterforce website. But my article is really following a lot of the themes that Anne just laid out. And what my article talks about is we focus a lot on the building side of the racial wealth gap kind of equation and building wealth. And it's really seductive because, it's about helping Black people, access home ownership, helping Black and brown people start businesses, helping Black and brown people save for retirement. And those things are really are important things, and it's seductive to stay in that space because you can write that research report with the smiling Black family in front of the house with the sold sign, and everyone feels good. But what my article talks about and what Anne's kind of keyed up is that it's only a part of the conversation. That really, when we're talking about closing the racial wealth gap, we also have to focus on the things that are the root cause of the racial wealth gap, and that is this extraction, this wealth extraction, this resource extraction. And Anne talked a lot about the history of how that is, but it still lives and operates with us today. At Liberation Generation, we talk a lot about an oppression economy. And we argue that this form of capitalism that we're living in today is that oppression economy, that it is an economy where the existence of systemic racism is something that creates profits. We talk about it as racism is profitable. And that this economy has been built up and structured so that it relies on the existence of theft, exclusion, and extraction, right? And that scenario redistributes wealth in the economy away from people of color and towards the very kind of institutional players in our economy. And that it relies on this dual financial system. And that dual financial system is on one hand, builds wealth. You have your mortgages, your retirement accounts, your secured credit cards, your lines of credit. I didn't even know what a line of credit was until I was well into adulthood. And then on the other side, there are these extractive forms of products and services, your payday loans, your subprime mortgages, and in many ways argue student debt as an institution on of itself, where these products and services have been created and set up, not to help people build wealth, but to extract resources. And the ways in which this is organized is racialized. We talk a lot, I talk a bit in the article about our credit scoring system and how credit score used to be, you went to a bank to get a loan, and you sat in front of the loan officer. They could look you in the face. They could see that you're a Black person, and they'll decide to lend to you whether or not. And we know at that time there's a lot of discrimination. Well, today there is a system in which that marker is built into algorithms, and they're in these algorithms. They can mark pretty well whether you're Black or not. And it shows because Black people have much lower credit scores on average than white people. Now, there's a whole lot of race neutral conversation that happens there, but that's what happens with our current system. And what that means though, is even if you're able to access that wealth building side of the coin, you probably pay higher interest rates. You probably have less home equity. You probably are paying higher insurance rates. So even if it's not, you have good products, because of the way the system is set up, if you're Black or brown, you are probably paying more for those products. And then the other thing that I want to talk a bit about, and I talk a bit about in the article, is the governments are also a part of this system. When Michael Brown died in Ferguson, Missouri, there was a report done that showed how the Missouri local government, in order to keep the taxes low on a certain population, made up that revenue through fines and fees, court fees, parking tickets, and the over-policing in Ferguson Black communities in order to make up that revenue. And Anne and Insight have done great work on this, so you should go to her website and see some of that. in San Francisco. So it is happening all over the place. And what I think is important to leave you with, and what's in what my article argues, is that our economy and our racial caste system reinforce one another. And in order to move forward, and I'm going to borrow a phrase that my co-founder Solana Rice uses a lot, is that we will have failed as a country and a movement if people have to take their reparations check to the check casher. And that we have to move to a place where not only are we helping people build wealth, but we are also dismantling these extractive systems.
Thanks, Jeremy. Gary, I wanted to bring you into the conversation next. And can you talk about your article in the series you developed with MPQ, and what are we learning in the field from community development leaders and others of how to build wealth, and to Jeremy's point, I suppose, how to end extraction in the low income and BIPOC communities? You're on mute.
How many times I've been told that one of these days I'll learn how to use this equipment. Thank you and welcome everybody. Really appreciate being here with such a distinguished group of people, as well as want to thank Shelterforce and Nonprofit Quarterly for giving us a forum to have this conversation. As Steve said, I'm Gary Cunningham. I'm president and CEO of Prosperity Now. We are a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that works at the national and grassroots level to build an economy that is just, fair, and free from structural racism. We do that through advocating things like baby bonds, pathways to affordable housing, overhauling our tax code, and many more things that we work on, both on the ground, meaning we're in communities throughout the country, but also we have a policy arm and a research arm that actually focuses on these issues as well. We partner with nonprofit partners, community development financial institutions, and others to build power, to build a sustainable wealth and prosperity for all. So that's who we are. When we started really having these conversations, one of the things that became very apparent to me is that our current framing of how we frame these issues in zero-sum terms is problematic. And it's problematic from a number of different perspectives. I want to echo and affirm both what Jeremy said and what Ann said. And so there's no disagreement that the problem is bigger than just getting someone a job or getting someone a home or getting someone a business. The problem is structural and it's systemic in its nature. And so when we frame these issues, we have to think about them from a multifaceted perspective. And we have to think about the magnitude of the problem that we're trying to solve, and then match up solutions to that magnitude of the trillions of dollars, hundreds of trillions of dollars, I should say, that have been both extracted and exploited from communities of colors in this country. And one, we can go back to 2008 and the crisis that shook the country with regards to the stock market crash, the Great Recession. We can see that from the African American communities, Latino communities, indigenous communities had huge wealth extracted from those communities and a great wealth transfer, and nobody went to jail. Nobody suffered any penalties for that big, basically, as one politician once said, that big sucking sound that came out of the Black community and out of the brown community and out of Native communities in that period of time. And so, we know we have some issues, but again, the framing seems to be in a zero-sum context. And as long as we frame it in a zero-sum context, it's going to be problematic. And that's part of the reason that we did this series on targeted universalism, because really targeted universalism to bring everybody to the table It takes into consideration the situatedness of whoever the dominant group is, but also brings into perspective those groups that have a different frame and have approached this in a different way. So for example, when we think about the issues that we're trying to capture, we all want similar things. Everyone wants their kids to do well. Everyone wants to have a good life in this country. Everyone wants to have health care, access to housing, et cetera. But not everybody's situated in the same way to that opportunity. And so a lot of times what happens is we develop universal strategies and then we attempt to lay them on to other communities, and it doesn't work for them because they're not situated, because of the history and because of what's happened in this country. They're just not situated in the same way. I would argue that if folks don't see their own interests being served, they will continue to hoard resources, et cetera. And so we need to be able to really move out of that zero sum to more what we call, John framed this, targeted universalism as a part of what we do. And so, and we have to also think about, we can't use the same strategies and techniques that got us here to liberate us from the current situation. So we need to actually use different approaches and different strategies that bring everybody together. And when we were talking earlier about this, one of the things that I raised is that, Robert Putnam just finished a book called Upswing. And in that book, and I talk about this in part of the article, he really talks about, we moved from kind of an us society to a me society, and that dynamic really changed the frame. So African Americans today are worse off economically than they were in 1960, due in great part to a backlash to the civil rights movement, a backlash that ended up being a forelash, if you will, with the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on us. And those wars on us were a backlash. One could say it was white elites, et cetera. But when you look at the dynamics of what's going on, unless we reframe the picture in a way that everybody can see themselves in it, that we have different strategies for different people and how they're situated, then we can stay locked in a polarized structure of conversation. And this is about power. At the end of the day, it's about power, meaning those that have the power, those that have the resources have been hoarding those resources. We have people in this country that have more resources, more money, more wealth than they could use in 100,000 lifetimes. And yet we sit up and fight each other. We have a tax code, a tax structure that basically, if you're wealthy, you continue to make money and continue to grow, and the wealth gap gets bigger because of how the structures are operated. Unless we change those, but we can't change them on our own. Us, people of color, Black people, et cetera, talking amongst ourselves about it actually can't change it. Really the change has to come from those in power. And today, most of those people that are in those categories actually don't look like me, don't look like the rest of the panel that are speaking today. So we need to be able to transform the system so it works for everyone. And a way that we can do that is actually developing those strategies and moving out of the zero-sum philosophy that we've had. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish. And then how do we talk about this differently so people can actually hear each other as we speak? So we're really trying to create a bridging with other folks as we do this work, because we not only need to have that conversation amongst ourselves, but both white elite as well as white working class also need to have these discussions among themselves. And they need to be able to have those discussions so they can see that all of us are mutually tied together in this situation. If in fact something happens to us, it's happening to everyone. And so, as my mentor once said, Senator Paul Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better together as we move through this process. And so that's how we're framing it at Prosperity Now, is really around a targeted universalist frame.
Great, thanks, Gary. I'm going to pass the baton to John. And John, obviously your article was about targeted universalism. Talk about how you contrasted it with equity and what a targeted universalist approach to addressing the racial wealth divide would look like. And you're muted.
John.
Yeah.
I often follow the lead of Gary. So Gary, you muted, so I did too. Thank you, Steve, and thank the panelists and for hosting this. This is actually a very important discussion. I'm glad it's getting out there on multiple platforms. So I'm gonna take a few minutes just to explain what targeted universalism is. And as Steve suggested, how is it different than the way we think about equity? And then a minute or so of how that's different in terms of how we approach these issues. First of all, I think it's really important that we're talking about wealth and not income. Usually when people compare groups in terms of well-being economically, they focus on income, which is not unimportant, but not nearly as important as wealth. So what is targeted universalism? Well, let's start with what is equity. So as some of you may know, I was involved in sort of pushing us toward an equity framework, along with Angela Glover Blackwell, Emmanuel Pastor, and a couple others in the late 80s and early 90s. It didn't take hold right away. People were still organizing around a narrow concept of equality, which was basically treat everybody the same. What was clear is that not everybody was in the same situation. Think about schools and sort of Title II money. So you could say, give every school the same, give every school child the same, when some kids need a lot more. So is that fair? Is that really equality? And there's a longer discussion about that. The answer is no. And it's inconsistent with the way our concept of equality really came from Aristotle. Aristotle understood that there was two different types of equality. One was where people were situated the same, in which case you treat people the same. One was where people are situated differently, where then you treat people differently. We actually embraced the first and forgot the second. And so in the United States, it became just treat everybody the same. And certainly after slavery and Jim Crow and the taking of Native American land and moving the border for Latinos, that would be an improvement. But it's not what Aristotle was talking about, and it's not what we wanted. So we talked about equity as a way of correcting that misapplication of Aristotle's insight, saying sometimes fairness requires that people get different things in order to be equal. So that was equity. What happened in terms of the application of equity, people started focusing on disparities. So in practice, equity became closing disparities between groups. And so the benchmark in terms of the goal was to get whatever the favored group has, or to close the gap between the less favored and more favored group. That does a couple of things. First of all, put groups in competition. Because oftentimes the assumption is in order to get there, we have to take from the more favored group and give to the less favored group. In racial terms, that means oftentimes taking from whites or white men and giving to women and people of color. And not surprising, the favored group, or whatever is designated the favored group, oftentimes object. And part of the objection is they're still holding on to the first concept of equality. But secondly, oftentimes they're not doing all that well themselves. Take, for example, the suicide rate. By some recent data, the suicide rate among white men is higher than African Americans. There's still a gap. But the gap is we need to have more Black men killing themselves in order to close that gap. Of course, no one wants that, right? That's not what we want. The goal is not just to get what white men have or white people have. And in some cases, they may not even be the favorite group. The goal is to do what? The goal is to end suicide. So the goal should be designated without it being necessarily attached to what any particular group has. And that takes us to target universalism. So target universalism says the goal is universal. It's something we all want, what Gary just laid out beautifully. And the strategy to get us there has to be targeted because we're situated differently. So we're not all in the same situation. We're all trying to get to the universal goal. So that's the difference between target universalism and equity. Target universalism is equity 2.0. It's basically saying we're trying to get everybody what they need to thrive and prosper in our country. And yes, whites may be closer to that, and they may be closer to that for a number of reasons, including the history of slavery and Jim Crow, but oftentimes they're not there. And then when you disaggregate whites, you see whites are distributed. So think about this. Let's say we're in a room, Gary and I are in a room, and a white person and Bill Gates is in the room, or Elon Musk. The disparity in terms of wealth in that room racially is huge. But I dare say, if Bill Gates left, that disparity shrinks substantially. So when we say the racial wealth gap, we're largely also including the white elites. When you look at most white people, and there's some articles on this, especially white people at 50% of the median, the lower 50%, the gap is much smaller. It's still there, but it's much smaller. And they're hurting. When you throw back in Elon Musk and Bill Gates, it looks like the whites are doing great. In 1970s, we moved to a neoliberalism, liberalizing the economy, liberalizing trade. And the promise was this would actually create greater wealth, and we'd all be better off. And only half of that was true. It did create greater wealth. The size of the economy since the 1970s, depending on how you count it, has grown between 3 and 4 times. So we have 4 times as much wealth. You have to adjust it for inflation. But we have a lot more wealth today than we did in the 1970s. But where has it gone? In large part, it's not gone to white people. It certainly hasn't gone to Black people or Latinos. Where's it gone? It's gone to Elon Musk. It's gone to Bill Gates. It's gone to Amazon. And so when we just look at white people putting all those together, we don't actually capture the facts that whites themselves have actually not been doing all that well. Yes, they're doing better than Blacks as a group, but they're suffering too. And if we don't acknowledge their suffering, then we're not likely to get their support. And I'm not suggesting that we not talk about race, because our situatedness not only says we talk about race, it says talk about it granularly, to talk about the conditions that Black people live in and what's wrong with those conditions. But it also gives space to say, let's talk about the conditions that many poor whites live in. So targeted universalism then becomes both a communication strategy, because we say we actually do care about everybody, but we recognize that people are not similarly situated. And we care about those most vulnerable, and what Jeremy and Ann talked about in terms of extraction, people who have been historically excluded and taken advantage of. So it creates a different set of policies, it creates a different platform, and it creates a space where there's more bridging. Bridging happens when we can see each other's suffering, when we can hear each other's pain. And oftentimes, if we have a binary, we can't see each other's suffering. And then when we can't see each other's suffering and hear each other's pain, we not only fail to see us in our complexity, we also create greater polarization and fragmentation, which diminish power. So that's the article I'm talking about. And so I call Targeted Universalism Equity 2.0, because it's trying to correct the practice of equity from the concept of equity. Equity was always supposed to be about everybody, but the practice came just focusing on disparities. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, John. So we're going to move into some more conversation, jumping into each of these topics a little more deeply. And I want to start by raising the question, and several of you have already started, of uncomfortable truths. So when it comes to the racial wealth gap, there are many uncomfortable truths. We're going to start with Jeremy, but we're hoping that we can name some of these and explain why they must be addressed if we're going to succeed in achieving systemic change.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. And I want to start with, before I say what I want to say, it might sound like I'm disagreeing with some things that have been said before, but what I think I do not at all disagree with is that the belief that we all do better when we all do better, right? So I think those words by Paul Wellstone are right. I think the thing that I struggle with, that again, I think is this uncomfortable truth, is the conversation about white folks in relationship to, say, Black folks, when there's poor Black folks and poor white folks. Sounds like this academic exercise or this narrative exercise in which we are trying to convince white folks that their well-being is tied to that of Black folks. And while I think that that's true, and others on this call might believe that that's true, they don't believe that that's true. And I think it shows out in a lot of polling. I think it shows out in the political activity they do. And I think and so we get in this place of like, well, we want to convince them, and we spend a lot of time and effort and energy and money trying to convince them of this thing that we believe. Toni Morrison once said, racism will end when it is no longer profitable and no longer psychologically useful. And what I think that speaks to is the reality that in our structure and system, in our economic systems, in our political systems, in our cultural systems, and in a lot of that, there is a real value to whiteness. There is value that exists for being white. And it is not imagined, it is not philosophical, it is tangible, it is real, and it is material. I don't think it's we know Black schools with almost all Black students, or even multiracial schools, get less resources than predominantly white schools. And this often cuts across class distinctions of the students. So when there's a backlash to integrating schools, it is because people feel and perceive a direct threat to the value that their whiteness brings them to have better performing schools than Black students. And the reaction is often to a feeling that something, and I'd say in many cases, the reality that in order to get to equity, something is being taken away. So I don't want to live in a world of zero sum, but in some cases, some privilege that comes with whiteness has to be taken away in order to get to a place where you have racial equity. That's just something I believe. Is that the case in all things? Hopefully not. But in a lot of things, I think it is. And we have to deal with that reality. We have to deal with that truth. And, you know, I think at the fundamental end of it is, it's not an issue of cajoling or convincing. It's about building power to change the structures and systems so that that value for whiteness is diminished and goes away and becomes something that is no longer profitable or psychologically convenient anymore.
You know, one of the things, you know, wealth flips the script on class, right? That's one of the things I want to bring forward in my article. It flips the script. When we look at the wealth holdings of the Black middle class, well, one, let me just say this, which I think really does startle people to hear that when we think about wealth, there perhaps has never been a Black middle class. And we can see that through even current data. When you think about that, the Black middle class in terms of wealth by income have the same amount of wealth as white folks in the lowest income quintile, then you know that there's something there that's amiss. When we look at this in terms of education, that a Black person who's graduated from college has less wealth than a white person who dropped out of high school. And it seems counterintuitive, but as education increases, those differences get wider and wider. I call it the $1 million problem when we look at people with the highest levels of education, those with a doctorate, with an MD, a JD. You're talking about $1 million difference in wealth holdings. So, you know, we need to have a much more nuanced understanding of how class works when we think about wealth. and the fact that there still has been advantage, right? There still has been advantage for those with the lowest levels of education and those who have low incomes. And so when we think about our solutions, we have to really think about what does it mean? What would it mean if we actually did have a Black middle class in terms of wealth? I think we would have a different set of solutions than we have today.
So I'll jump in. So a couple of things. I think we on the panel agree pretty much on the goals. I think we disagree on the best way to get there, which makes sense. And also, I think we disagree somewhat on the facts. So let me just sort of complicate this a little bit more. Malcolm X said racism is like a Cadillac. There's a new one every year. So racism is not one thing, it's many things. And I think when we don't actually look at the complexity of it, we miss a lot. It was W.B. Du Bois talked about the psychological cost of racism, but he talked about the cost being largely something that actually hurt our democracy and hurt white people. And so when if you look at almost any data, probably the most well-known demographer today is Ross Chetty. And he's looked at where their racism and segregation are the greatest. Everybody does worse. So yes, white people are doing better than Black people generally, but white people as a group are not doing better generally. If you look at life expectancy, we're the only industrial country that has 2 or 3 years where our life expectancy, and that's mainly on whites, is actually going down. They're not doing better materially. So the cost of whiteness or the benefit of whiteness is actually declining. David Roediger wrote a book called The Wages of Whiteness, which he does a beautiful job of looking at what you get for being white. He's a friend of mine. And I said, David, you got to write a new book called The Declining Wages of Whiteness, because what you get for being white today, materially, has substantially declined. And across almost every indicator, white men, which was the gold standard up until the 1970s, as a group, working class white men hasn't had a substantial wage increase since the 1970s. So what's the benefit of whiteness? Whiteness is not one thing. It's an ideology. The benefit is what Robert Sapolsky called largely symbolic. And that symbolic benefit is also declining. 2 more things. After George Floyd was murdered, and we can interpret it in many different ways. We can argue about the meaning, but we had the largest outpouring of people, including white people, for some form of racial equality. When we just talk about white people, we lump everybody together. We lump, the Bernie supporters and Trump supporters. We lump. So what I'm saying is that, going back to what you just talked about, Ann, yes, there's a difference. That difference actually is complicated, but targeting universalism says, let's look at that difference. Let's look at how different groups are situated. And I can tell you, having taught for 10 years at The Ohio State University, where I work a lot with people all over the country, but also people in Appalachia. People in Appalachia, whites, I actually said to them, and I don't even know why you call yourself white. They call you white trash. They had a descriptor to your name. The average death for a man was 50 years old. He's not getting anything. The intergenerational poverty was at least 3 and 4 generations. Nobody was graduating from high school. There was no adult over 30 who had a whole full set of teeth. And all I'm saying is that it's not that we move away from the situation of Black people, but you include those people. And it's not to convince them. Many of those people are already convinced. So I don't think we spend all our time convincing them. I think we spend a lot of our time convincing ourselves. The idea of bridging, which again, we were one of the progenitors of the concept of bridging after Putnam's book. 5 or 10 years ago, there were about 30 groups doing bridging. Now there are over 1,000. But it's not something that we've always been doing. And I can tell you, frankly, there are not many Black groups who are seriously engaging in bridging. We're not trying to convince white people of anything. What we're trying to convince them of, I think, is that we, Black people, have a hard time and they should fix that. We do have a hard time. But if we don't include them in the story, if we are not willing to even consider their pain, we don't build power. we actually fracture power. So I think our goals are the same. And maybe they'll be multifaceted in terms of our strategies, but it can't simply be to say white people as a group are doing fine and racism is actually paying off, when for a lot of white people, it is not paying off materially, and even the symbolic paying off is declining. And then I will end by saying, and I'm not trying to be an apology for white people, but there are white people struggling to be in the conversation. From my perspective, we largely push them away. And I've been in meeting after meeting where people have basically used very colorful terms to describe white people. And the people in the meeting are there who are trying to make common cause. The wealth gap is huge and is troubling, but I think we need to disaggregate it and sort of create some standards. The gap is important, but create some standards. What should every family have in America? And that's partially what the baby bond does.
Thanks. And Gary, I want to go to you anyway, so let me try to, you can respond to John.
Sure.
And also, I want you to talk about this, pattern, which it seems every time there's a movement for civil rights, there's also a backlash, right? And we're seeing that in real time today. So what do you see as narrative interventions to address that? And, you've talked, I think, both about the bridging type of things that John's talking about, as well as building cohesion within movements. So.
Well, I actually say that while there appears to be some big divide here in this conversation, I don't really think there is one. I think we all agree that the history of segregation, denied opportunity, slavery, Jim Crow, all contributed to our current situation, treatment of people by either ethnicity or race in this country has been a cornerstone of what this country has been built on. I'd also like to bring us that this economic inequality, while we talk about it in the US, is worldwide. I mean, this isn't just an issue here in the United States, it's actually a worldwide. And Thomas Pickering, in his book, Capital and Ideology, which John had me read, which I don't recommend for everybody because it's a huge tome, but he actually goes through and says, well, what are part of the reasons why this is happening throughout the world? And, based in colonialism and imperialism, and we get our present day outcomes from what has happened in the past. So I think we all can agree on that. I also think we can agree that nobody's trying to convince anybody to, live next to me, or I'm trying to convince them that this is the right thing. But I think when you look at the issue of power and how power is distributed, you actually have to say, and I use this as an example, and this comes from John Nash, who's an economist and mathematician on game theory, and he came up with what's called the Nash equilibrium. And part of that is an equation, but I'm simplifying for this spot, is that if you have a group that's in power and that group doesn't see a reason to give up any of its power, it will maintain the status quo because it's not going to give up any power without some kind of force acted upon it. And then on the other side of the equation, because these things have to balance, is groups that are out of power. And one of the ways that groups out of power can actually gain more power is by bringing over members of that other group into the frame. But the other way they can is by building social cohesion, so that what it, as Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so being clear about what it is, even though we may have large disagreements and have a big tent, we've got to agree on a few things that we want to get done. So this country, one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, has done the least in terms of the social safety nets for low-income people in particular, that has a huge correlation with race and a huge correlation with ethnicity. And so the fact that we're not actually building the structures and the system to build wealth and the structures that we had were racialized. So the New Deal that created the biggest middle class, the banking industry, which redline communities, et cetera, we've already talked about that. The fact that those things exist, they exist because they were benefiting one group or a group of people against other folks in our society. And that's how we got here. So we need to own that and say that's what it is. At the same time, if we're going to change the power dynamics, we could talk all day about what has been done to us. But unless we somehow can change the prediction of the framework, and I can tell you today, if you look at the elections, if you look at polling, you look at all of this, that the issues that we're putting on the table don't have the support of the broad constituencies within the white community in general, but the white elite more particularly. But I'd say in general, if you look at the polls, that when we talk about things like baby bonds or other things that we know, reparations or other things we know that would move the needle, there's not a lot of public support. So the question for us is, if we're smart, is how do we change that dynamic? Because if we can't change that dynamic, we can academic this all day, but we actually have to change what's happening on the ground for real people on the ground in our community. So
I mean, we have to be willing to be more explicit about anti-Blackness. And, I hear what you're saying, John, but I don't hear you talking about anti-Blackness explicitly, because it undergirds, it's a very foundation in which every one of these economic policies that we've been talking about today is founded on anti-Black racism, on anti-Blackness. So when you think about something like even the social safety net for a white woman in Maine who is subject to punitive policies and is suffering and is harmed, it is because it was driven by anti-Black narratives around a welfare queen, right? And so yes, all people suffer. Yet we can't have a discussion around anti-Blackness because we're dancing around it, talking about all this other stuff, right? Let's get to the root cause. The root cause is anti-Blackness, period. And it harms every single American, right? It's not that we don't know that there's not suffering, but what is the framework that we're going to use to help people understand why they are facing these conditions? Why is it that you're facing this condition when you are on Medicaid or on TANF? Why does that exist? What's the reason? So I just think that we need to think a little bit differently when we talk about what are mechanisms in which we could actually build greater multiracial solidarity. I think that tackling anti-Blackness is a way to build multiracial solidarity, because we can really see and understand explicitly how it's come to hurt every group and the ways in which that happens. We have to address the tropes and stereotypes that drive policy. And at its root, anti-Blackness does drive policy.
So Anne, we know each other well enough. I mean, I wrote a book called Racing to Justice, which the whole book is about the history of development of anti-Black tropes and the structure. And yes, I'm an academic, so I actually study this stuff. So I do know where it comes from. I do know, for example, that at the beginning of slavery, Blackness as a category didn't even exist. I do know, for example, that when slavery came into effect, whites were not considered the dominant group. They were considered the middle stratums. It was the elites that was the dominant group. And what they asked for was the middle stratum, including the slave patrol, was allegiance to the elites and patrolling Blacks. That's part of our history. But I'm saying what we've done is we've stepped away, from my perspective, from what came out of that, which was white supremacy. It didn't start. The original slaveholders, the original colonialists, did not consider themselves white. They were the elites. And in the discussion, for as far as I'm concerned, it's not that I'm not willing to talk about anti-Blackness. I think we give the elites a bye by lumping them just with white people. They're not just white people. There's something else going on. And going back to what Gary said, I think the way you talk to people, that when they first passed laws actually trying to create racial categories, and part of that was in 1619 anti-miscegenation laws, people thought it was crazy. because the people who worked the land leading up to the Bacon Rebellion were from Europe and were from Africa, and they weren't at each other's throat. That had to be cultivated. And all I'm saying is that, so yes, let's talk about that history, but let's talk about the ideology of white supremacy and not confuse it with white people. We talk about race being socially constructed and being a system, but usually we focus on individual white people. And I'm not trying to give white people a pass, but I'm not trying to give us a pass either. So yes, it's a system, it's a structure. How do we move forward? And part of it is we have enough there to build common cause with a lot of people around the world. And I'm not saying we don't talk about anti-Black racism, what happened to us. I have a chapter in one of the books with Edwin Kennedy, who sort of put this back on the table after fairly recently. But we also have to be willing to actually talk about other people's pain, which is also Native Americans, the taking of the land. So it's not like we don't have pain, but other people have pain too. And talking about other people's pain doesn't mean we can't talk about our own. But it does create the possibility of changing things and creating enough cohesion, as Gary said, to actually build power to make change.
If I could jump in.
Oh, please, Jeremy. Go ahead.
I have a lot of thoughts. They're scattered, so I apologize if this sounds a little scattered. So I'm gonna tell a story that is not academic. It's an anecdote of my own, but I think I could find a representative sample if I did the work to find people that have had this similar experience. You know, I went to one school board hearing in my entire life as a parent, and I went to that school board hearing. And what happened at that school board hearing was that my son went to a pretty mostly white elementary school where I lived. And what happened was the people wanted to hire a math teacher. The school raised the money to hire a math teacher. But the principal said, well, I can't hire a math teacher right now because the school is frozen hiring. And even though you've raised this money, we can't hire a math teacher. People launched into a conversation about how they could take what they believed was an extra math teacher from a school across town at a largely immigrant school and bring that teacher over to their school. So I think what's happening here, and I agree with you, John, around the way that we talk about white people, it's complex. But I think the complexity is not just like poor white people and the elites. There's a lot of people in the middle that are reinforcing the ideology of white supremacy and benefiting from the ideology of white supremacy that you talked about. And we as a society can't deal with those folks in a way that I would say strips a lot of the power hoarding that they are currently a part of away from them. We are not going to be able to move forward. So it is not just about the white elites, and it's not just about the white poor. It's also about this group in the middle who see their own well-being tied to this ideology of white supremacy and, as Ann says, anti-Blackness. The other thing that comes to mind is you're right, we are disagreeing about how to do it because there is another way to do it. And we saw it 2 summers ago when people took to the streets and they said, enough of this. We don't have time to wait on folks to get it. We are going to organize, we're going to build power, and we are going to take it. And some of that momentum still exists today. And I think that a lot of conversations that we have, a lot of time, are to stifle that energy. And I have no interest in stifling that energy. I'd actually like to catalyze that energy because I think if Black folks and people of color are leaning into their power and making demands for the things that they want and the things that they need for their communities, and maybe white people will come along with them, maybe they won't. But that is also a pathway to the power that you're talking about. So I don't think it's fair to say like, okay, well, the only way to get what we want is to hope that some white folks agree with us. No, there is a path where we can work and mobilize and organize and build the power to take it for ourselves.
So I talked about that equation, and both can be true at the same time. So the question of organizing and building social cohesion and building a movement is critical and needed and necessary. to change the dynamics of the power structure that we have today. So I would agree with that. I wrote an article for Nonprofit Quarterly on this question of rethinking the path to Black liberation. And it's a complex issue, but I used the work of Ian Haney Lopez, who's a professor at University of California, Berkeley, wrote a book called Merge Left, where he did polling and research and focus groups on the question of how do we get to a more just society. And part of what he found out is the way we're framing the questions. And he did this with Black activists and Latino activists and whites, et cetera. So it was a pretty well-rounded both polling and research. But what he found was the way that we're framing the message, that people don't see themselves in the picture. And therefore, we're basically splitting off a whole group of folks that would support that because it's in their interest. And he really was focused on working people in unions and other things. Also, what he found was that even the message ourselves, when they took it to activists, people actually didn't buy into their own messages. Where I came down in that article really was about this issue of how I've done report after report, Jeremy. I know you, John, all of us have been writing on this stuff for a long time. And I just came to a different place that we actually do need to uplift, that anti-racism by itself won't get us there, that we do need a pro-Black agenda. Black people need to have their own pro-Black agenda, but we also need to have a pro-Black agenda in corporations and school districts, et cetera, because when you have a pro-Black agenda, then you're really going to honor and respect and ensure that we have systems that work well for everyone. So I'm not opposed to the issue of addressing the anti-Black, but we also contribute to this, how we talk about it, what we're doing to enforce it, and that really realizing that the message that we have, if we want to win, if we want a winning argument around these issues, we're going to have to change our frame because it hasn't been selling in terms of the policies and structures change that we need to see. We are at a time of punctuated equilibrium. This point that we're at in this fixture right now is a point where great change can happen, but we need to seize the time with regards to how we approach this, because we are going to need a multiracial coalition in order to get there. And we're not going to build a multiracial coalition unless people see themselves in the picture.
Well, let me just add one thing, though, to say is that I will say, I've been doing advocacy work for, over 20 years now. And I will say, I in that experience, I and many advocates like me have spent a whole lot of time wondering what white people think of the things that we're putting forward. So I don't agree with the point that we aren't considering white people when we do the advocacy work that we do. Actually, we understand that calculation around like how will the moderate Democrat or the swing Republican think about this thing that we do has always been a part of the calculus since I've been in doing this work. So I'd actually put forth that what would be revolutionary would be to think about what would the young Black woman in Minneapolis who witnessed George Floyd being killed think about this policy that we're doing and trying to put forward. That would actually be more radical to me, I think, than actually wondering what Joe Manchin and his constituents would think about. I think that they're actually represented often in these conversations pretty well, because I feel like I've had to think about them a lot over the point of my career.
So Jeremy, I won't do a time thing with you, but I can tell you I've been doing this a lot more than 20 years. You talk about complexity. It is complex.
That's not a short time though, John. I've been doing a little bit.
Speaking of time,
All
can I
right.
throw in a question here?
I mean, I'm just saying the time, I've been there too. There's a complexity not just in the white community, and it's not just, as you said, poor elites in the middle. It's complexity in the Black community, and there's been sometimes serious movement. And I can give you a ton of examples. And part of it is how we frame things. And, you know, which is interesting to me, because what I keep saying is everybody should have a voice. And it's not just strategic. Yes, we need to build power, but it's not just strategic. That's the kind of world and society I believe we're trying to build, where everybody has a voice, where everyone counts. And it's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. It's all over the world. And, you know, Bob Dylan said, every man thinks his burden is the heaviest. So I think sometimes we have a hard time listening to other people. And I'm not saying we don't still speak ourselves. You know, I'm doing work in India and Africa, literally, and watching people, same impulse. You know, I'm gonna tell you about my kid, but not about my opponent's kid. And I'm saying, if you don't talk about your opponent's kid, your opponent stays your opponent. And it's not like, you know, let's trick them into supporting our thing. And so we've had, at times, huge movement. And, you know, Gary and I did a study on the Black woman in Minneapolis after the killing, and the Black community was split. It was all over the place. And it wasn't just the Black activists and the Black organizers. It was a whole hue of people. And I'm saying creating space to deal with that complexity, and also acknowledge that we may have different roles. But ultimately, whether it's through demonstration in the streets, and frankly, I think by itself, that's not going to get us there. I'm reminded of the debates with Frederick Douglass and the anti-abolitionists before the Civil War. When they were, from my perspective, from Frederick Douglass' perspective, they took the most radical position. You can't work with Republicans. You can't work with Lincoln. He's an accommodationist. And eventually, Douglass said, I'm going to work with him. And Garrison Keillor and some of the others wouldn't even speak to Frederick Douglass after that. And so I think from my perspective, part of it is having the space to actually engage in multiple strategies and recognizing there's probably not a single one that's going to get us there.
Thanks, John. I'm going to jump in with a question here just to move. It's been a great discussion, but I wanted to ask about scale, and this, anybody can jump in on this one, but you know, what solutions are actually big enough to address a racial wealth gap that, you know, it's been estimated at $10 to $12 trillion.
So I'll start off on that, but I wanted to hear from Ann, because I want to make sure Ann, do you want to start off on that?
Well, I want to say this is a question we always get, right? What are the solutions? And I want to say one thing first. We don't even have a grasp on the issue, right? We don't have an understanding of how wealth is accumulated and extracted. We don't have a vision for what we want to see going forward, right? We don't have a movement in place to make that happen, right? So we jump to solutions. Oftentimes we want one or two solutions. And the fact of the matter is, it's going to take a myriad of solutions. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. It's going to we need movement on the ground that's based on a North Star and a vision. We don't have a North Star when it comes to this work on the racial wealth gap, right? We have a number of well thought through policies across a number of spheres that people have been putting out for years. And those policies need to be considered, but it needs to be done in a way in which we can actually see that this adds up to meeting this North Star that we're working towards, because it is a huge issue and it has to be tackled across a number of spheres. We know in the studies that we've seen that something like a baby's bonds, if it was implemented in a way where young adults got $25,000 to $50,000, could go a far way in reducing those differences. But I still argue that the racial wealth gap is a measure, and it's not a goal. It's not going to tell us more than this is how one group is positioned and this is how another group is positioned, right? Also, we need to be thinking about this more creatively. You know, when you go out in community and you talk to folks about wealth, they talk about this issue much different than we do in these spaces. Their vision is much broader. It's much more communal. It goes beyond the financial to something much more transformative, in my view. And we've yet to get there, because oftentimes we have these discussions where we pluck out policies here and there. So how can we do this in a way that actually leads to a new North Star? And that would be my question for us, for those that are working in this field.
So thank you, Anne. Really appreciate that. I think there's some things not interpreted or being misinterpreted or whatever, because what I am saying is that we don't need to sit around and worry about what white people think. We don't need to try to put it in a calculus and then try to see how we position ourselves. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that if we want to change the world so it works for everybody, then we have to have everybody at the table actually talking about it together. And that we won't get there just because I'm frustrated and angry. We're going to get there because we built power. And we built power not just by demonstrating in the streets, because we've had demonstrations going back to the early founding of this country on up to the 1900s, when there was all kind of race riots against Black people, et cetera. So we've had these demonstrations, and time again, we see ourselves in the same situation. So I asked the question, if we're not going to be Sisyphus with this and we're going to create sustainable change, we have to do it in a different way than we've approached it in the past. And we actually have to be able to consider not only our own situation in relationship to that, but how do we build power and allies to get there? The issue of racism in America, or racialized systems and structures, isn't going to be fixed because I feel like I'm gonna get there from here, or I'm gonna go out in a march in the street. It's going to be addressed when everybody sees it in their common interest to move forward together. And that process actually is happening, meaning we are seeing some changes occur, even in the most recent past, that I think point to some positive trends in this direction. Is it happening fast enough? Not in my opinion. Is it happening in a way that is going to address all of the harm that's been done and repair all of the harm that has been done to all of us over all these many years? But it is moving in the right direction. And we can continue to see that happen if we're smart enough to reframe so that we can actually leave a legacy of having a world that's better off than we found it.
I'm gonna duck the question as well, but I'm gonna do it in this way, Steve. Audre Lorde says, the master's tools could never dismantle the master's house. And what that makes me think is, the types of energy that I spoke about before is the type of energy to force power to allow you to the table to start to bring the solutions forth. And I think the way that I'm going to duck this question, Steve, is I'm not going to give you a solution, but I'm going to suggest a pathway. And, the pathway for how we built this economy was that groups of people who were to be oppressed by the systems and structures that were set up were not a part of the architectural team that devised and designed the economy. That they weren't there at the beginning as the systems were built upon themselves. Back to the history that Anne talked about in the opening and John has talked about as well. I would say the pathway forward is one in which those folks are on the architectural team of what we are going to rebuild after we dismantle what we have now. And that is the path that I think drives us towards the place where we have what we will have never had in this country, which is a true economy that works for everybody, no matter your ethnic background, no matter your gender, no matter your sexual orientation, no matter your gender identity. So I think that the path forward has to look different. The tools that we use to devise and develop that new economy cannot look like the ones that we use to build this one.
So I want to just underline what Jeremy said and punctuate it in a couple of places. You think about what the drafters of the Constitution, they were all white men, most all of them property owners, and most of them had property in other people. Most white people didn't get to participate. No women got to participate. Certainly no people of color got to participate. It was a small club. And they drafted the Constitution. And the Constitution was in part designed to literally, no pun intended, constitutionalize and protect certain kinds of property. So what Jeremy just suggested, which we talk about in terms of belonging, co-creation, who gets to not just join something, gets to co-create the very thing they're joining. Now, that's very radical and it's very foundational. That's what a democracy in its best form is supposed to be about, that the people make the laws and institutions that then they live by. We've never had that. Michael Omi said we have a racial dictatorship where we're playing with that now by saying, you know, even in this flawed system of voting and democracy, we want to make it harder for people, especially people of color, to participate. We don't want to make it easier. We want to make it harder. We want to go back. So I think one of the pathways is really making sure, as Gary said, everyone's at the table. And everyone's at the table with the capacity to really participate. And sometimes that capacity will also mean the capacity to exercise a veto. But I think, and again, I think there are many different ways of doing that. And I can tell you, we are moving backwards and forwards at the same time. We're having people experimenting with guaranteed basic income, and we're having people basically saying, we have, you know, Steve, you know, we have the Supreme Court saying women can't control their own bodies. So we're moving in multiple directions at the same time. And I think it's important to actually hold on to those positive strands and try to build on them. It's easy to get despondent in this country. But I'm concerned that despondency doesn't translate into action. So to me, it's part of the beauty of that is that sometimes people, you know, it's like, it's a radical idea, but it's an old idea that people get to actually shape the things that control their lives. It's both radical and old at the same time. And people means all people, not just white men.
Thanks, John. I want to follow up with that. There's a lot of questions in the chat, then we're not going to be able to get to all of them. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of questions around targeted universalism and how we move that forward given the wounds that are present and the psychological effects of racism, which are very different from the material effects, or can be different from the material effects. So I want to raise that to you, but then also raise to everybody the question of levers for change, which is we've touched on it in a number of ways, but I want to come back to it to a focus. How do we give people a sense that this issue is solvable and not insurmountable? And what are the first levers of change, which may be a little different than saying, what are the solutions?
It's a great question. And again, consistent with this panel, it's complicated. When there've been national surveys in terms of people's mental well-being, emotional well-being, loneliness, trauma, and this was going to surprise people. Blacks actually turned out pretty well. The group on some indicators that was the worst off emotionally were white men. And I think the reason is because they've had something and they feel like they're losing, or Black people, they never had it, right? But for whatever the reason, there's a lot of trauma in our society. I think there are different ways of thinking about this. I think how we're represented in the culture matters. It won't surprise people who saw it. Black Panther had a huge impact positively on the Black community. So the cultural representation, how we see ourselves, if we see the, I do a lot of work in the healing area. Some people know work around the mind science, implicit bias. We work closely in that. And to be seen, the South African word sabawanu, to really be seen is incredibly healing. And there are different ways people can be seen, whether it's through cultural expressions, whether through someone listening to them, whether through books or poetry, whether through dance, whether through music. So I think we have to actually operate on multiple tracks. Some people will not be in a position to actually take risks initially. Some people are. There'll be some of us who are, tending to injuries and wounds. There'll be some of us who will have little space to actually think about what's next, to imagine a future. I think at some point, though, we do have to get more and more people, not just imagining a future, but actually building a bridge to a different future in a way that we're talking about, where everyone participates. So I think that can happen, but I think we have to be deliberate about it.
While others are thinking, I just want to pull out one question from the chat because it's something that I had also. It would be great to have an example in a particular area of what a vision, a targeted universalist vision would be, and how we would talk about it. So the person in the chat works in the area of food security. They were asking about that, but it could be any.
A very quick example. I mean, there are many. I work with a large school system, which I won't name, but you would know it if I did, who went through a tremendous strife. And it was at Black and Latino parents wanted to pull their kids out of the schools. You probably know that the fastest growing homeschooling is happening in the Black community. They felt like their kids weren't safe in the school. The schools asked us to come in and help. We did a bunch of things, but one of the things we did, first of all, we acknowledged the pain that the Black and Latino families were experiencing, and basically said, yeah, if my kid was at the school and they didn't do something, I'd pull them. That validation meant a lot because we had been brought in by the superintendent. Superintendent was a little shocked. It's like, are you siding with they're trying to destroy the school system? And so part of it was being heard, but then we talked about the school system putting in a mechanism to actually make sure that the kids were protected. And the whole thing shifted. I mean, it was quite amazing. It was over a couple of years, but parents didn't pull their kids out, but they felt like they were heard. The sort of suspension and expulsion that had been rampant, that way down. So part of it, again, was, and that was a real example. And then we talked about creating something for all the kids, not just the Black kids, not just the white kids, not just the kids who were, trying to get into Harvard. And it worked. And some of that's been written up on, but we have done stuff like that with health. So I think the platform can be applied to many different situations. But the point is that sometimes people, to your question, is that sometimes when people are really hurting, you can't get them into a problem-solving mode until you attend to their hurt, until you actually acknowledge that and let that quiet down. Then they can sort of think about what's next.
Can I offer an anecdote, Miriam?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So Gary and I are from Minnesota, which some people call like Alabama with a smile as it relates to race relations. It's like some of the worst disparities in the country exist in Minnesota, and some of the I've experienced as a Black person growing up there, some of like overt forms of racism. And George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd happened in Minneapolis, and what happened though after inspires me, and I think is lever for change, where some of the same people that were mobilizing on the street developed a different vision for public safety that didn't include the police. And they put that on the ballot. Now it lost, but it got 40% of the vote. It got 40% of the vote. So, and shout out to Candace Montgomery and Black Visions in Minneapolis, who was one of the organizations that led this charge. And I don't see it as a loss. I see it as progress in a place like Minnesota, which it would have been absolutely heresy to ever think that the police wouldn't be the ones in charge of community safety in the city of Minneapolis or even in St. Paul, where I'm coming from. So what's key there is it is movement folks developing the solution through their lived experience, building the political power and moving it into the political space of democracy. That is what I think, to me, when you talk about levers of change, those are the levers of change that I would like to see. I would like to see more of that locally, state level, even at the national level, where people who are in community are the ones that are coming up with these solutions, putting them in the political system and moving them forward towards a different vision that likely we could have never envisioned before. So
since Jeremy invoked me, that we're both from Minnesota, and I grew up on the very block where George Floyd was killed. What I'd like to say is that everything you just said is correct, Jeremy. That those groups did move an agenda forward. The agenda still is on the table, but it gotten blocked, I would argue, because of backlash and how the framing played into that backlash. So I would argue that, yes, you're right, and that we do need, we at Prosperity Now believe that the solutions to these issues aren't sitting in a think tank somewhere. They're actually coming from people on the ground that are experiencing the situation firsthand. And that's why we work on the ground on these issues. But we also know that in order to actually change the political dynamic and change what we see happening, that we also have to figure out how we change our frame so we can pull more people with us on this journey, as opposed to polarizing the situation where then we actually don't win the bigger battle, whether it's police reform, whether it's on economic opportunity. If we're going to build the power, and I keep focusing on that we need to overcome the current situation, we're going to have to actually think about how we reframe our message so it works across the political divide.
Well, I think I'd argue, and I think those organizers will argue that battle isn't over and that they're still fighting it, and that they
I didn't say it was over.
Changed that conversation.
I did not say that battle was over. I'm saying we want to win the battle.
Well, I think that we believe they believe, and I believe they will. It's just a matter of when the win comes.
All right. Just one more thing. I wrote an article on this when George Floyd that was published on, fighting this battle with the Minneapolis Police Department, and my admiration for the folks that are fighting this battle, but also talking about the complex history that we went through to get to that moment. So that moment wasn't just a moment, it was a moment that was built on a lot of different work that went on before that moment occurred. And the same with the civil rights movement and other movements around the country. It's not like one moment, it's actually a series of things that have happened to trigger that moment to happen. So I'd say it's that groundwork that got laid prior to that really created the conditions for that change to take place. But again, that battle is still being fought.
Thanks, Gary. Anne, do you want to have the last word? And then we need to wrap up, unfortunately, because we're at time.
I'm just going to go back and say that I feel very hopeful in the conversations and the work that we've been doing with communities on the ground and how they're thinking about the issue of wealth inequality in place. And the radical imagination and dreaming of areas where we don't often talk about in terms of this issue. People talking about untapped genius, folks talking about issues around love, and what shared prosperity could really look like. I don't even think we've begun to tap into what's possible. And I'm just talking specifically on the issue of racial wealth inequality, that there is both, yes, an understanding of a history and of some of the trauma around that, but really a desire to dig into joy. And whenever that really comes to the fore, people are excited and are really talking about how we get to a model of greater shared prosperity. And we've seen communities not shy away. These are multiracial communities, not shy away from talking about and addressing anti-Blackness. I'm excited about what's possible when we start looking at this locally, even though we know that the problem can't be solved locally, but there's certainly actions that can be taken, harms that can be addressed, ways in which communities can come together. And to me, that's where I find the hope and the ability to move on a national level if we can move more on a local and state level.
Great, thanks, Anne. I want to wrap up. There were so many great questions. I know we couldn't get to many of them, but I want to also thank our audience for all of your participation. And I'll thank my co-moderator, Miriam Axel-Loop from Shelterforce, Gary Cunningham from Prosperity Now, John Powell from Othering and Belonging Institute, Jeremy Greer from Liberation and Generation, and Ann Price from Insight Center for Community Economic Development. As I mentioned, there will be follow-up with the recording and with the articles that were mentioned in this webinar. And thanks so much to everyone. Our next webinar at MPQ will be on June 9th, and will feature our second economic justice editor at MPQ, Rithika Ramamurthy, and she's going to be leading a discussion again Thursday, June 9th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on wage justice now. So with that, thanks to everyone for your participation.